Look, let me first start by sharing an incident that happened some years ago. And even before I do that, let me acknowledge lots of you in the audience. I can see Urvashi, I see Ambassador Gail, I see Alina this morning, many of you whom I've not met for a long time. And it's glad to meet in Stanford. And let me go back to that incident that I was mentioning. Many years ago, I remember some wise person, and this is when Mariche was in politics. I think she was asked by someone that do politicians get technology? Something like that, right? And I remember Mariche responding by saying, well, that may be true, and we struggle, and many politicians are coming to terms with the fact that they need to engage with technology. But the question is, do technologists understand politics? And do they understand social sciences? And do they understand the causes on society, the implications on society of the innovations they produce? And I think that's pretty much something that must be the centerpiece of everything we do in terms of managing our relationship with technology in the future. That how does innovation by design respond to the social circumstances in which it is produced, rather than creating disruptions in the societies that they inhabit? Now, of course, there are two famous people. Both of them would have something to do with this university at some point in their careers. One, of course, was Charles Darwin, and who himself said that unless you adapt, unless you adopt, unless you embrace change and innovation and transitions, you perish as species. Someone more recently, in 1968, in his seminal book, predicted that if the rate of change and the rate of disruptions reaches a certain speed, scale, dispersion, it destroys societies and institutions. And that was Samuel Huntington. Political Order in Changing Societies, if I have the name right. Otherwise, it's something like that. Don't hold me for the title. Go and Google it. But it's one of the books you must pick up and read. Because I think that hypothesis was for a very different world and a very different society where there was no AI and there was no synthetic news and fake news and mediated histories and futures and worldliness. But those fundamentals remain the same. And I think AI regulation is about this. It's about how do you continue to adopt, embrace, and benefit from what technology and innovation offers us as human beings, as planet, as a society, but at the same time, putting guardrails that prevent us from getting to the tipping point where institutional breakdown, the breakdown of societal structures and of political and other arrangements does not take place. I think that's it. That how do we prevent a high-speed collision, even as we exult in the thrill of speeding down the express highways that innovation and technology allow us to do. And I think that's the medium that we are trying to discover. Easier said than done, completely and permanently elusive. And it always will have to be, in some sense, a feedback loop that allows us to readjust and recalibrate. Now, there's another reason why today is an important time to be discussing this. And by the way, I've been noticing it, but I didn't realize the scale of it. Courtesy the report, and I was on a flight. I was on a long 16-hour flight from Athens to the West Coast, and I read that Americans have passed multiple regulations in the last couple of years, more than what they've done in the last 20 years or 25 years. There was it came out of the Stanford report. I think it was all about the report that Stanford produced. And if Americans are beginning to regulate, we are in trouble. I think this is a red flag. A country that doesn't understand regulation, if it starts regulating, then we are in deep trouble. For example, if EU is innovating, by the way, it is. That's what the Stanford report says, that some of the biggest gainers is EU. The continent has done really well in the AI age, better than it did in the previous cycles of innovation. It tells you that the world is changing and people are beginning to respond to what's happening in different ways. The report also says something else, that people are anxious about this technology, that there is an underlying concern about this particular technology, at least in the universe they polled. That may not be the case if you travel, say, 7,000 miles and enter a geography in the global south, where there is still a general euphoria and belief around innovation, around technology, around products that are changing their lives because they see it. They know that today is better than yesterday, and they know that tomorrow will be better because they see how technology, along with policies and along with political leadership, and in other cases, young demographics, is actually changing their societies. So it also perspective matters. Where you sit is how you stand on certain issues, and I think that's important to also highlight here. But yet, the moment you scratch the surface of the transformative implications of AI, and both in our part of the world and this part of the world, you get to the heart of the established foundations of political philosophy, of legal thinking, of societal arrangements, and of course of market dynamics. Now, I sometimes speak very fast and I make English sound like a foreign language. So I have the PPT here so that you don't lose the key points I want to convey through my presentation. But otherwise, my narration would be very different to what you read on the screen. It's just for all of you to make sure that what you don't understand is possibly relating to what you see on the screen. It may not. I may change my mind as I speak, right? So we are really talking about entering into a realm as we enter into the questions around managing AI and regulating AI and policies for AI and for unleashing the power of AI. We're really talking about rejigging our entire contracts, political contracts, social contracts, economic contracts, philosophical contracts, religious, spiritual contracts. We are entering into a very wide space where the human condition itself is being renegotiated. And I think that's important. If you bring it down to a transactional question, for example, granting copyright status to AI systems, we would need to grapple not only with the intellectual property regimes, what is individual right, what is proprietary right, what is AI right, what is personhood for AI, and where does one end and where does the other begin? How do liabilities get apportioned across these fluid rights that are now being apportioned to them, and through what principal agent relationship or a new legal contour of an AI society should we actually intermediate and disperse both responsibilities, liabilities, and power, right? Each time we attempt to regulate certain aspects of AI, we also find that the goalpost shifts. The problem space that we are trying to regulate has changed on account of evolution, on account of its dispersion, on account of its adoption. And it has deep implications for any legal, regulatory, or administrative regimes that countries with very feeble institutional capacities are implementing. Now, you heard James mention that hundreds of countries have announced laws and regulations to deal with AI. Well, hundreds of countries have basically announced laws and regulations of AI that will never be implemented. I think that was a complete sentence. That most countries are great at making laws and terrible at making them work. And it's not because they don't want to. It's the same reasons that afflict development, that afflict progress, afflict policies and regulatory spaces as well. And therefore, I think the big challenge for all of us is to think about regulation that does not burden the citizen and the society, where technology is beginning to implicate its progress, and its directions. So what is the format of regulation which takes away the burden from the policy maker in, say, a country in Africa or Asia or Latin America, and actually makes it a part of the cost of business, of the cost of design, and the cost of bringing a product to market? So can we, in some ways, create in situ regulations by design? So the design itself allows us to actually remove some of the harms and some of the risks and promote some of the principles that all of us have been trying to grapple with for so many years. And regulation by design is certainly something which, in the AI space, I believe is apt for implementation. The question here, of course, is, and of course, I'm going to come to that in a bit. The big challenge here is that there are certain regulatory trends that prevent this from happening, and of course, the one that I'm not going to focus on, but it is the elephant in the room. One of the biggest trends to prevent in situ design of regulation is today the polarized world that distrusts international offerings and international corporations operating in national jurisdictions. I think there is now, because of the polarized politics, there is also a disconnect between transnational corporations who are now recognized as transnational corporations. That age when they believe that Facebook was for all is over. Facebook is American and it is viewed as American, and it must be understood that irrespective of the fact that everyone uses it, it doesn't make it, it doesn't belong to everyone. It still belongs to a certain jurisdiction whose Congress sees the appearance of the owner of Facebook to ask any other parliament in the world to summon him, and if he will appear there. I think that will tell you the distinction today, that 25 years later, all of us now clearly know that these platforms are not global. They are there for the global market, but they are controlled through very closed jurisdictions and mechanisms. Therefore, we have now a regulatory landscape that is polarized. We have a problem space that is changing and expanding. We have the problem that is unforeseeable. We don't even know what we are trying to regulate in the space of AI. Many of my colleagues and me, and we are putting together a paper for the G20, where we are referring to an approach called moving horizon regulations paradigm in AI. It's a moving horizon, and you are now trying to build regulations in this scenario because you don't know what you're regulating for. You don't know what is on the other side of the innovation, and you don't know the geographies that are going to be implicated by the regulatory regimes that you are producing, because there are implications of regulation themselves. There are consequences of GDPR, for example. And I think Urvashi is speaking later. Please talk to her about it. That there are regulations that you think keep you safe, but they have consequences for 7 billion people as a spillover. And we have to start thinking about AI regulation as a moving horizons regulation that enshrines principles, that has in situ design, but is contextual to the place where it is being, where the product is being offered or the service is being delivered. And can we come up with a moving horizons regulation paradigm for AI is a big question that we are working on. And I was just talking to Marichya before we started this morning that maybe it is time for a Stanford ORF or a US institution and a Global South institution to come together and bring thinkers and philosophers and economists and political scientists together to try and give shape to this moving regulation and support the work Ambassador Gill and his team are doing at the UN. And I think that's something that is really important at this time. Therefore, let me move to the 3 regulatory trends that I think are important as we think about this moving horizon regulation. So the first is I'm going to use old terms, but I'm going to give it a new twist. Okay. So the first is the tragedy of the commons. And we have heard about tragedy of the commons in a number of resource-based industries and climate change and others. But I'm going to use this for AI. Now, unlike traditional commons, data is not a finite resource, nor naturally endowed. However, ownership of the individual over personal data is a near universal principle and covenant across jurisdictions and geographies, certainly amongst countries that seek to defend the liberal order. Now, there are a few countries who may not agree with this idea that ownership of personal data is a generally accepted principle, but most do in some way or another. Sometimes grudgingly, sometimes excitedly, but it is certainly something that is true. However, proprietary algorithms and computing infrastructure lead to the perversion of the relationship between an individual and their data, gaming of intellectual property regimes, non-personalization of personal data at the scale at which big tech operates through positive feedback loops, and existing repositories of user-generated content during Web 2.0 have all diluted ownership and accrual of benefits to users with no remedial consequences. The big boys of Web 2.0 are going to be the big boys of the AI futures. And this is something that is now irreversible unless regulatory intervention. Now, look, no one should think I'm either a socialist or a Marxist or a communist. I believe in markets, and I believe in the private sector, and I believe in enterprise, and I believe enterprises are part of the solution. And enterprises need to be having these conversations within themselves. So, free, diverse markets are good for every enterprise, and that is what we are trying to preserve here. We are not trying to break up companies or disrupt operations of companies. I think we are trying to get companies on board to rethink about what we are trying to achieve here. But the first, Web 2.0 has decided the winners of our AI future. And I think that is a bad assumption to begin a new revolution with. And how do we, in some sense, shake it up and allow others to come in and participate through a level playing field is going to be one big regulatory question for all of us. It is also important that data of individuals collected during Web 2.0 under certain terms and conditions through certain contractual agreements, those contracts and those agreements are reassessed when that same data through those repositories is deployed for generating revenues, generating products, generating futures through the AI capabilities that companies and countries are generating. So this is the tragedy of the commons. It has nothing to do with the original term. I'm just playing with the words here. But it is a tragedy of the commons. The second is the prisoner's dilemma. Now, AI development depends on large volumes of data and computational capacity. The data troves possessed by the big tech like, say, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Google, some of India's own fintech companies, some of Chinese companies. There are lots of companies around the world that have billion people plus data sets now, very large companies around the world. Many of them, because of this capability, have trained large AI models with positive feedback loops and with products that flow from all of this. Now, of course, this has raised anti-competition concerns in many jurisdictions, predominantly in the EU. These systemic issues give rise to newer forms of dilemmas that need to be managed within AI governance. The dilemma of competition or collaboration and current market structure within AI development and deployment that enables or constrains these two particular attributes that we seek to preserve. There is limited work on incorporating consumer-facing evaluation metrics for transparency and accountability to inform consumers of the AI system's emerging risks. And here is important. There are two regulatory underpinnings today. One is a principle-based approach. And I think AI ethics and conversations flow from there. And the other is the risk-based approach. All our national AI policies flow from the risk-based approach, or most of them, right? And I'm going to come to that in a bit. But there are two underpinnings, principles and risks. And in some ways, if you want to marry the principles with the risks, you need to have a consumer-facing evaluation matrix which makes AI accountable, algorithms accountable, and informs consumers of the systemic risks. And I think this is an important point. Now, given that incorporation of evaluation algorithms increases computational and development costs, companies are faced with the choice of either securing the systems to build trustworthy AI or maximizing the speed of innovation while weakening the guardrails. And this is the prisoner's dilemma. All companies are today faced with the tedious task of building accountability mechanisms or the quick and easy go-to-market solutions that will allow them an edge over their rivals. And like in the original case of the prisoner's dilemma, all of them cheat. All of us are going to market first. There's a competition to get to market without necessarily building the guardrails that protect. AI is not badly regulated. AI is not badly governed. AI is an ungoverned space. And we must understand the distinction between the three. AI is an ungoverned space. It is the laboratories of innovation that are describing the framework of its existence. There is no social contract that has been negotiated, even partially, on its deployment and on its use. Therefore, it is time to start thinking about something as basic as a do no harm principle as AI comes into the market. You know, when I was growing up, I used to read Isaac Asimov, science fiction, and we used to have the 3 laws of robotics. The robot shall not harm a human being used to be one of the principles. And I'm going to come to that in a bit. Our markets are designing AI to harm humans. That's the largest chunk of capital that's flowing today. And I'm going to come to that in a bit. But that's the prisoner's dilemma. And the final is the skin in the game. And here I want to very quickly make 2 points. One, we mentioned about regulatory capabilities and capacities and competence all over the world. Let me tell you, AI requires a goldsmith, a very fine eye, very specific regulatory instruments that inhibits very specific behaviors, allow others that will spur innovation. But it requires a fine regulatory regime, a chiseled regulatory regime. All our regulators have only one thing, a hammer. So we are seeing that in countries where the benefits of AI in terms of economic benefits and political benefits are not accruing, the regulator has no skin in the game to invest in building that fine eye for regulation. They are using the regulatory hammer and they are coming down heavily on AI innovation that is coming from outside their borders. So countries which have limited economic gains from AI industry as such, or from employment, or even from a strategic advantage that they may get through their weapon systems or political power, they are today using the regulatory hammer on managing AI. It will have deleterious consequences because their societies will lose. They must understand this, that if you use that regulatory hammer, you're preventing the adoption and the benefits that accrue from innovation to your own societies. Others, actually, and as a corollary, have really no skin in the game. And there are spaces and countries who have literally turned their eye away from the consequences of AI, from the implications of AI, and they have allowed AI services of all varieties from all comers to abound in their market spaces. And this is again very interesting, that two neighbors, one has a regulatory hammer, other doesn't even pretend that AI exists in terms of regulatory instincts. And both of them inhabit the same space in my continent, in other continents, even in this continent where I'm standing. You will see that variety of regulatory approaches. One is ignore the consequences. Second is come down heavily on it. And we need to start creating a new format where we actually incentivize regulatory conversations, which are today happening only in a very small elite community, most of them sitting in this room, and some of them also across the Atlantic in Europe. An American-European conversation on regulation is now being sold as a global conversation on the future of AI. And I think this Eurocentricity has to change, and we need to give people the belief that it is their future and therefore their voice that matters most in the debates that go forward. We have to change not only the skin in the game, but the color of the skin as well. And I think that is equally important. Representation and inclusion for regulatory conversations is as important as the biases in the data sets that we are trying to respond to from a more technical perspective, right? Regulatory conversations also have to be far more inclusive. And this is my third point, regulatory trends, right? But there are also some market perversions. And this is the point I was making, that these are not new. They've been with us for at least half a decade. Many, many years ago, before the pandemic, so which means at least 6 years ago, I was in a conference on AI in Chatham House. I saw a couple of people here who were there with me at that conference. We've all grown old together, survived the pandemic, well done. But I remember walking down Soho and I had a white box advertisement. I saw a white box advertisement for a sex companion, AI sex companion, and without naming the company or shaming anyone, I'll just tell you what the cover read, what the lid of the box read. It says, "Meet Sheila. She will quote you Shakespeare. She will wish you happy birthday. She will bat her eyelashes, and she'll never say no." This was the sales pitch of a white box in London, selling us AI sex companion, undoing in one print of that particular message 2,000 years of human efforts to change how we engage with each other as humans. The questions of gender, misogyny, patriarchy, courtesy. Let's look at the secretarial assistants and look at the anger and aggression with which we deal with them, the sexually laden messages that are communicated to them. There are numbers that tell you, and I don't want to read all of you. All of you can Google and find this out. So I don't want to go through the numbers. But the fact is that a large part of our early experience with autonomous and intelligent systems has been rather poor. And they are not new. They've been here for nearly a decade. What have we done about it? Market has prevailed. Regulation has lost. It's good for conferences. It's not good for changing the way products are being produced. And I think that's an important point. But let me tell you what worries me even more is the defense sector. Demand for dual-use emerging technologies. It worries me more, not because the other is less important. I think the other is most important. This worries me more because this is a flagrant violation of the basic ethic of AI, which should be about doing no harm. And yet we see that major powers are pouring money to develop military applications, smart munitions, killer drones, smart borders, basically killing machines, lethal killing machines that will absolve the human of having made that decision or having pulled the trigger. I think that's what we are trying to do. And the US Department of Defense has requested US 1.8 billion in 2024. China spending just a tad less at US 1.6 billion a year on AI. And you have many others who I'm not naming, but you have a huge ecosystem of close to 30 to 40 billion dollars on an annual basis that is being spent to teach how machines how to kill better, how to harm humans better. What happens to the conversations on AI ethics when the largest amount of money going into the production and development of AI is actually quite unethical? Here's a thought. Suppose we were all to agree to a global agreement that let AI be the tool that helps us prevent loss of life in conflict and never be used as a weapon in conflict. Let's see what are the AI systems that can reduce civilian casualties, that can lower harm, that can prevent loss of life and infrastructure. Let's use AI differently. Use it for war. I'm not saying don't use it for war, but you don't use it for killing, because the spillover effects of defense applications enter our societies. The internet that we use was a product of one of those spillover consequences of defense investments. AI and AI products are going to be used in our homes as well. And we really need to be thinking about what are we producing in the labs. So I think that's the two perversions I really wanted to think about. Now, let me quickly worry about three socio-economic trends or socio-political trends. The first I'm really worried about is the consolidation. I think AI represents the end of the decentralized market space of innovation. Internet was the peak of decentralized innovation. AI is the end of it. The computing cost, the big data sets, the repositories that we mentioned have now made it nearly impossible for startups not aligned to one of these big platforms to really come out and build their own big enterprises of the future. AI could, without our intervention, without a sensible regulatory regime, mark the end of the decentralized age of innovation, where everyone with a dream could become something. I mean, and this part of the world represents it most. So the first trend is consolidation of AI, and of course, the liabilities thereof. So I think that's really, really important for me. That are we now reaching that age where all the benefits of different geographies, dispersed demographies, different economic stratas, using the power of innovation to change their life and those of their people, is that age over? And if it is over, then we would have lost something really precious, certainly in our part of the world, which is just emerging in the decade gone by. Right. The second I really worry about is ethics, and I am worried that the conversation on ethics is a dilution of the adherence to international law. It is being used as a free pass to not do anything about things that we need to be doing things about. Sorry if that made sense, but that is basically my big worry. The normative prescriptions and realpolitik don't necessarily converge ever. And nowhere in the last 75 years have we seen them work out. Why are we assuming it will work out in this particular domain or sector? And I'm really worried about how do non-binding principles translate into effective regulatory regimes that protect, serve, and empower others. And I think this is something that even the United Nations in its recent, and Ambassador Gill is here, in its recent efforts to begin this conversation on AI, shied away from. They discussed AI, but did not discuss any legal process to bring AI into the international legal regime. So it was very cleverly orchestrated, because they are only as good as the member states are. And the member states are not willing to discuss this in any significant way. So let me basically move towards the end of my presentation with two ideas. One, we need to harmonize. We need to harmonize various efforts that are happening everywhere. I think the OECD and EU principles have become the default norm, or the base around which others are beginning to have these conversations. But principally, we must understand that our appreciation of AI and its role in our lives is very different. You are creating wealth and weapons through AI. We are removing poverty and saving lives through AI. And therefore, the regulatory conversations have a different tone, texture, and content to them. We must we must harmonize regulatory conversations, and we must ensure that you bring folks from Argentina, Brazil, India, other countries in Africa and South Asia, bring all of them in. I think more the merrier, and bring them in, give them a skin in the game, give them a reason to be there, give them the respect that they deserve in making the effort to have a conversation on something that is only going to be part of their lives a decade from now. And I think that's the effort they are making, and they must be given due recognition for that. They are more committed to this project than you are. You are already living it and enjoying the benefits of it and suffering from the consequences of it. They are lending you a hand as outsiders coming in for something that is only going to affect them a decade from now. Bring them in and harmonize the regulations. Moving horizons regulation is also about changing the horizons of those who we believe are important for making those regulations happen. And I think that's something that's really important. The second, of course, is we have to move towards regulation of consequences. Very important. In a real world, I always give people the example. I want to prevent car accidents. I come up with a legislation that will limit the speed. I come up with speed breakers that will make the driver slow down. I will come up with rumble strips if there are children passing through that particular lane. And I'll come up with a set of physical actions and legislative ideas that can prevent road accidents, right? And I think that's heuristic human tendency to actually control and manage events is going to probably be the failure of AI regulation if that is implemented in that particular domain. We have to move towards a regulation of consequences rather than the regulation of actions. And that is the big change we require. How do we rewire our minds, unlearn and relearn how to regulate consequences, and mostly regulate consequences in situ as it is designed and not as an afterthought, which means that the engineers will have to understand political science far more than our political leaders need to understand engineering. And I think that also equation needs to change. This rubbish that politicians don't understand engineering is passé, boring, in 20th century. In 21st century, engineers need to understand political science, bring them into the political science classes. So in situ, regulation of consequences by design has to be a principle we need to adopt as we harmonize our regulations. Then I always talk about the pandemic paradigm. I think the pandemic has taught us something important. And nothing more important for any of us was saving our lives or saving the lives of those we love during those 2 years or 2.5 years that all of us were suffering from it. What did we learn? We learned that when we were dying and there was a vaccine innovation on its way, we still went through a 3-stage testing before we allowed it into our bodies. If something as important as a vaccine had to go through 3 stages of testing, and national jurisdictions had to approve it before it was allowed to be injected into different demographies, why is it that we are so careless with injecting societal changing innovation into our midst? It is time to have regulatory sandboxes, city-scale testing, people-scale testing, and then finally commercial operations. I think we have to learn from the pandemic paradigm. AI must not be given the free pass. AI must have to go through testing that allows us to ascertain the collateral implications of its presence. And that's something the pandemic has taught us. That when we were dying, we still went through a rigorous process. Why is it that for making billions, we don't put the billionaires through the same rigorous process? I think, and this idea that no, they're very small and you are adding a regulatory cost to it is rubbish. Mom and pop stores who sell food on the streets of India and US have to go through the same food and drug approval process. So this is rubbish when you use the idea of size to bypass a very basic safety regulatory implication. We do that all the time in everything in our lives, but no, because it's technology, it has to be good and it has to be given a different treatment. I think that has to change. The pandemic has taught us that when we were trying to save our lives, we did not shed certain rigor. I'm sure we did, and there are lots of papers on that, but still we went through certain process, and we need that certain process before we allow certain technologies to enter into our midst. And then, of course, I'm not going to break my head because it's not going to happen. Finally, we need algorithmic accountability. And I think unless you are able like you have financial accountability, like balance sheets are audited, like you have experts, chartered accountants and CPAs, who go through figures and numbers and data to ascertain the health of an organization. The health of a product has to have similar audit mechanism. It has to be a audit mechanism that refreshes itself, maybe every year, every 3 years, every 5 years. We would come up with a sensible audit mechanism. But the idea that you could have black box algorithms in an age where transparency and light is the only solution is very dangerous. And I think do not think that I don't like AI. I love AI. I use ChatGPT 4 and I'm waiting for 5. And I am one of the first to adopt every technology. I put myself at risk. Please think about regulation so that you can save me and yourselves. Okay, so thank you very much.